Is it worth caring about your privacy after years of sharing data? How do we handle contact backups? What's the state of voice assistance, RSS, the efficacy of mass surveillance, and different security strategies? Welcome to the Surveillance Report 203 Q&A, where we answer your questions from our amazing patrons who allow us to make this podcast for all of you, who keep us going, and just, are generally awesome. You can view and join the questions on patreon.com/surveillancepod and xmrchat.com/surveillancepod. Our first question this week comes from Ken, who says, one of the most prevalent issues I have encountered with how privacy is approached sometimes is the mindset that many have, and admittedly, sometimes I have as well, of, well, they already have anything anyways at this point, so what can I do about it? It's kind of a sunk cost fallacy. They've been watching a lot of channels since they're late teen. However, they've still made mistakes, and they still sometimes use Google and Windows because of how long they've been in those ecosystems. They feel like it just doesn't matter if they move, not to mention the difficulty of sometimes doing so. So the question is, what do you do against the argument where you feel like you're in too deep to meaningfully take control of your data? And secondly, what steps can you take to clean up past mistakes in how you treated your data? And is there any guides for doing so with common platforms and ecosystems? So in regards to that first part, my argument, and I wrote a whole blog post about this. It's actually my most viewed blog post. Okay, so the illustration I used in my blog post is, let's say you're driving somewhere that you go all the time. It doesn't matter, like the office, a friend's house, whatever, and you hit a stop sign and you take a left. And after about 10 or 15 minutes, you kind of snap out of your highway hypnosis and you're like, oh, wait a minute, I was supposed to go right. I'm going the wrong way. To which my question is, do you just keep driving? And the answer is, of course not. That's completely insane. You're going the wrong way. You turn around and you go back. Just because you've been doing something for so long, when you find out you're wrong, you need to turn around and go the other way. You don't just dig your heels in and keep doing the thing. I've mentioned before, I used to be one of those people who put full real name, I think date of birth, home address, everything on Facebook. And I'm not going to blame people who do that kind of stuff because they don't know any better. But once they know better and they keep doing that, at that point, it's kind of like, dude, what are you doing? So yeah, that is my argument against that. And there's also a practical argument of data gets stale for a while, after a while. Okay, my date of birth is probably never going to change, but where I live, dude, the address that I put on Facebook when I used to live there, I don't even live in that same damn state anymore. So this whole idea of well, I'm in too deep. Yeah, maybe right now you are, but in 2, 5, 10 years, that data is going to change and it's not going to be relevant anymore. There's also the privacy as a spectrum argument. So for example, you mentioned I still use Google and Windows. You don't necessarily have to give those up entirely to have more privacy, but you can also for example, you could use a different search engine using Google as an example. You don't have to use the whole damn Google suite. You don't have to use Google Search and Google Calendar and Gmail and Google Drive. You could switch over to other things that are a little bit more privacy respecting and give them less of your data. Will it be as good as giving up Google entirely? Of course not, but there is a spectrum there. So my answer to the second part is, what steps can you take? I think number one, again, privacy is a spectrum. There's a saying that I've heard a few times in the personal finance community, which is you probably didn't get yourself into debt overnight. You're not going to get yourself out of it overnight either. It's the same thing here. You didn't just wake up one day and send everything off to Google in one fell swoop. That stuff has been built up over years. So first thing is, do something. Take any steps. Even if it's only a couple small steps, even if, like I said, okay, you know what, today I'm going to switch to Brave or DuckDuckGo or Ecosia or whatever. I'm going to switch to a different search engine. Great. Start there. We something. In terms of specifically, you said cleaning up past mistakes in data. I think the easiest thing would be using data removal websites. We partnered with Easy Opt-outs, but there's others out there if you want to use someone else, or doing it manually. I'm a big fan of, there's a service I've started using called Redact that will link up with certain services like Facebook, Discord, Reddit, and it'll go through and delete your old comments and your old content. I think those are a great thing. If you really want to go the extra mile, you can start contacting companies directly and be like, hey, I want you to delete whatever data you have on me. Here in the US, they're not required to do that, but I think it's a good start. Sometimes there's not much you can do. You can go out, you can empty out old accounts and then delete them, which I would recommend doing it in that order. I wouldn't just delete it. I would delete the content too. Really, it's just getting started and starting to go in that direction. And eventually the data is going to be outdated. It's going to be stale. It's not going to be relevant. And one day you'll wake up and be like, oh, there was a data breach that we covered on the podcast that didn't affect me.
I've typed out some notes here. So for the first part, in terms of, the sunk cost fallacy. I mean, you say yourself it's a fallacy, so you don't even need to really dive too much into the arguments, but we're still going to go there because that's not a convincing enough argument for people. I think one thing that's really sad about the world is this isn't just a privacy thing in my eyes. So I'm not going to talk about privacy to demonstrate my point. A lot of defaults out there, like the most convenient thing is normally the most damaging thing for those around you and the environment and the ecosystem. And a good example of this is like a plastic water bottle might be the easiest, most convenient thing, but it also has probably one of the most damaging impacts on the people around you. On the topic of the environment, if your local lake is super dirty because of pollution, do we just throw in the towel and go, well, it's already polluted, so guess we just move on to the next lake? Or do we say, actually, we should actually deal with this problem, and yes, we've already done a lot of damage, but we can reverse the damage, we can see what we can do, we can at least not make it worse. So there's still a lot of proactive things that you can do despite a history of issues. In terms of your kind of 1.5 question of what do you do when you feel like you're too deep? So if that lake is too dirty, I listened to a podcast recently about, funny enough, like some of the very preliminary research on plastics and the impacts that they have on health. It's preliminary research. They're still trying to figure it out. But the tough thing about it is there's not much people can do. It's kind of just everywhere. And so all that doctors and scientists can recommend is preventable risk factors, which is just avoid plastic water bottles, don't microwave plastics, try to avoid them in your to-go containers, etc. But outside that, they can't really recommend you live off the grid and catch your own rainwater. That still probably wouldn't solve the issue, by the way. I guess my point here is that just because something's hard to do doesn't mean it's not worth still doing, just because the default is easy. And also, take care of your preventable risk factors. What you've done is not a preventable risk factor. If you've been smoking for 10 years, that's no longer preventable. It's done. But do you know what happens for people who smoked for 10 years? If they quit for 10 years, they're almost just as likely to develop dementia as someone who never smoked in the first place. I don't know if I got my years right there, but the stat's very similar to that. So my point is you can still do a lot in the future, and it's good to think ahead rather than behind. In terms of what you can do, Nate already talked about a lot of steps, and the only thing I'll add here is that the most difficult and most time-consuming lesson of Go Incognito, the course on the Techlore side of things, is 2.4, which is how to delete your online identity. And it dives into this, and it takes a lot of people months to do. Minimum weeks, most likely months, because it is going through all your accounts, centralizing your accounts, seeing what you need to delete, swapping those services for other services, migrating data to those services. It takes a long time to do, and a lot of people can't do it in a week. So be optimistic and just have that like long-term goal in the back of your mind is all I can say. Next question is from Coffee Horse. Do you guys have any recommendations for syncing and backing up your contacts? They use an Android ROM and they have tried using Proton, but as they discovered, Proton doesn't sync to your local contacts. It just keeps it in Proton. Any suggestions? So I put 4 suggestions here. The first one is EtiSync, ET-Sync. I don't know how to say it, but it's ETE Sync, 3 letters, sync. It's end-to-end encrypted, but it's a little bit more DIY, and personally, I did not love how it synchronized on all other devices outside of Android. I feel like Android was its strongest selling point. And then trying to get it to work on other devices is a little iffy. And then the next option, underrated, is Tuda. I think a lot of people don't talk about that benefit of Tuda, which is Tuda actually does end-to-end encrypted contact syncing, and it works locally with your operating system as well. I haven't personally used it, but it's something they advertise, and if it works as expected, that's super underrated, and people should probably give Tuda more love for that feature. For the longest time, I synced contacts locally, actually, because I don't update my contacts that frequently, and it's a pretty small file. So it's not something for me that was hard to just like always dedicate one device for being like the most up-to-date device, and then every week, or I don't update my contacts every week, every few months, I might take that file and then kind of update it everywhere else. So that's kind of another thought. But I also just don't sync contacts that much because most of my contacts are on Signal, and that in itself is kind of a way to store contacts. So yeah, the last option to throw your way is a NAS, the 4th option, or some way to self-host it yourself. It won't be end-to-end encrypted, but you could at least store the data yourself, and then you could use card DAV to sync to all your devices individually. Won't be end-to-end encrypted, but it should resolve most of your concerns, which is like no third parties getting access to your contact list directly.
I don't really have anything to add to this. I use Nextcloud, which can back up all my contacts automatically. I mean, that's kind of self-hosted.
People need to remember that these legacy technologies are really hard to do with end-to-end encryption, and that's why there aren't great solutions for this. CardDAV is ancient, CalDAV is ancient, email and everything email does is ancient, hence why we see such limited options for all of these areas, and also why Apple, it's the only thing they chose not to end-to-end encrypt if you use advanced data protection in that iCloud ecosystem. It's those three things, and it's because they probably didn't want to bother or they couldn't guarantee basic levels of security with those technologies, is my guess. So
our next question comes from David Johnson, who actually asked 4 questions, because first he asked 2, and then since we didn't do an episode last week, he added another comment. But I'll try to keep these quick. So the first one is aimed at me in my 2021 blog post called Staying Informed Without Big Tech, which was basically about like RSS. I only mentioned 2 privacy respecting options, which were Tiny RSS and Thunderbird. Do I think this still applies today, or has the selection expanded? I honestly don't know. These days, I mostly just use Nextcloud News because I'm on the go so much. I have a lot of small moments throughout the day where I have like 30 seconds here and there to check my phone, but I don't have enough time to actually sit down and do anything majorly productive. By having Nextcloud News on my phone, that allows me to, when I have those 30 seconds, I can check the news feed. And then by the time I get home, I don't have to trudge through 150, 200 articles. That is not a made up number. That might actually be too small. When I get home, I've already got my RSS feed handled, and I know what articles I've already bookmarked to queue up in the news feed for the new oil. So that's kind of my workflow. I haven't really looked around since, but I remember at the time when I wrote that, I don't know. I didn't really know of a lot of options. And even like some of the ones that might be more friendly, I was really disappointed that a lot of the news feeds I tried were still algorithmic. Like I think there was one that I tried that I saw everywhere, like when I looked up RSS readers. And for some reason, it didn't put things chronologically. It still put them as like, here's a major headline story. And I would mark it red. And then an hour later, I would go check it again. Like, all right, what's the latest news? Here's that same story. And I'm like, but I already marked that red. Go away. Or, you scroll through it. And again, it's here's one from 5 minutes ago. Here's one from an hour ago. Here's one from 15 minutes ago. And it's like, I don't know. It bugged me. But to me, that defeats the whole point of RSS. So yeah, I don't know. If anybody has any better options, please, by all means.
On Android, Feeder is probably the best I've used. It's open source. I think you can get it from F-Droid. Really solid. And then on the like Apple side of things, NetNewsWire is the most popular open source one, but I think that it's annoying to use at times, and I think Reader is just objectively much better. But I don't think Reader's open source. But Reader's really good. REEDER is probably the best RSS client I've ever used, and it syncs via iCloud as well if you use macOS and iOS. Super cool. And it's a traditional RSS experience. But they just released a new version of Reader, which is more like Feedly, and I think that violates what RSS is supposed to do, because it's supposed to like not just be a chronological thing. So those are the options I can throw by people.
And then you say, per the same blog post, do you still think Nitter is the best way to privately view Twitter content? No. And I'm sure people are going to argue me and go, this instance still works, this instance. But in my experience, most of them don't work. Most of them because Twitter has cracked down so hard on external view. Like I've said this before, if you send me a Twitter link, I won't even click on it. I'll reply and just be like, I can't see it. Because there's an 80% chance if I click on it, I can't see it. Or if I do, I can only see the one tweet and not the whole thread that you're trying to show me. So, the best way to view Twitter content is to tell the person to post to something else. Like, I'm sorry, I'm tired of Twitter. I'm tired of pretending like I'm not. All right, so the second question you said, one or both of you sometimes say that mass surveillance does not work. Could you clarify how you believe it fails? And you listed some examples, but I can cut through it very specifically. I can cite studies. There are multiple studies out there who have looked into crime rates before and after surveillance and like adjusted for the different variables. And it is just an objective fact. Mass surveillance does not work. It does not reduce crime. It does not solve crimes. It does not reduce police workload. It doesn't work, objectively speaking. And there are some other things you listed, like you mentioned, I believe it was Henry actually pointed this one out. Snowden mentioned that we're now ingesting so much data that it's impossible to parse through it, and people end up slipping through the cracks. Although, as much as I hate AI, I think AI is actually a response to that problem and will help with that problem. It'll still get a lot of things wrong. There will still be things that slip through the cracks, but I'm sure it will help. But no, I base that statement off just objective studies and facts that show that we've studied years of mass surveillance and been like, what crimes have you solved that you can objectively tie back to mass surveillance? And the answer is like 3. in the last 20 years. It doesn't work. It doesn't justify the cost. It doesn't justify the privacy violation.
The next question is, what's your opinion of security by being different from the majority of users? It's a variety of security by obscurity, and what do you think are good ways to employ it? I think that where this is good is developing malware is really expensive. Employing malware is expensive. It gets cheaper and cheaper over time, and there's ways to make it, easier to do. But generally speaking, people want the best value and get the most amount of infections and the most amount of money at the end of the day. And normally they're not doing that by developing and pushing out Linux-specific malware because not many people use Linux. So most of the malware is developed for the most popular operating systems because Linux is not immune to malware. It's just not that popular, and so the obscurity kind of works in its favor a lot of times. It's not the only thing going for it, but that's one big thing. So I think that if you're just concerned about general threats on the internet, you're not a target, you're not someone who you think is going to be a targeted individual for anything, I think that this is actually not a bad thing to try. The more niche of a tool you use, the less likely you are to be caught in some massive operation to infect a ton of people. But that should never be the only thing you rely on. We say this all the time. Security through obscurity is just a small tool you can use in your arsenal, and it shouldn't be your only tool. What I don't think it's good for is for people who are in targeted situations. If you're somebody who is an activist, a journalist, or somebody who feels like they might be targeted, this will not be a long-term strategy for you, because once people figure out what to use for you, they can just develop the malware to infect you on that platform as well. So I'd say it's a targeted versus wide net attack difference here, if I were to offer my opinion.
I don't really have too much to add to that. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head. I wouldn't make it a deciding factor. If your choice is, for example, using cubes, which doesn't do anything you need it to, but it's more obscure and it's harder to hack, versus using, Mac, which does everything you need it to, but it's more mainstream, I would go with the Mac. I would view it as a cherry on top kind of thing. If you happen to be a little bit more obscure and you have that additional security as a result, great, but you should be looking at other things instead, in my opinion.
And then what is your opinion on and approach towards the opposite of the interpretation of security by obscurity as not standing out from the majority? Let's say scrutiny by mutiny, if there isn't a term for it already. In other words, security by blending in. I gotta say, I think this is where definitions are really important of security, privacy, and anonymity. I think that security by blending in rarely ever makes sense to me. I've seen some YouTube comments recently of people who say, oh, using Proton is less secure because it's obscure. But I feel like if I were to ask them, no, but why? They wouldn't really have a good answer. So they unironically suggested Gmail because it's what everybody uses. I just don't understand that argument, and it's super misguided because at the end of the day, Proton's giving you the ability to do end-to-end encryption. There's a much better metadata protection. It's open source. You can verify that things are doing what they're supposed to be doing, versus when you use Gmail, you're pretty much committing to a company that can read everything you do, and they can track and serve ads based on what you do in your emails. So I personally just don't understand this argument. Now, where this argument and this question might be a little bit more genuine, I think, is when it comes to anonymity. If you're in maybe a repressive regime and the use of a tool, or if you're in a abusive relationship and again the use of a tool could in any way jeopardize you and your safety, that's where you're going to need plausible deniability. You need to say, oh, I just use Chrome, I use all these tools, pretty standard stuff, but really behind the scenes you're able to use more niche tools. So there is a layer of that, but that's a very specific threat model, and I don't think that's what people are referring to when they say things like, oh, I'm going to get better security because my fingerprinting protection is better in Chrome because everyone uses Chrome, which is objectively not true, by the way. If you can look at research studies of fingerprinting, and you'll see that your fingerprint is just as unique on Chrome because there is no fingerprint protection. So you are not blending in with everybody else using Chrome. That's objectively false, and it's one of the most common misconceptions I see about browser fingerprinting. It's not true, and I'm really upset to see creators spread that narrative as well because it's false.
Again, don't have much to add. Yeah, I thought that too when I was reading this question originally. I'm like, I don't know of anyone making the argument that security is better, although apparently you do know of people making that argument. I would say there is an argument to be made that your privacy would be better, but I think it also depends on a lot of different factors, like the Chrome thing was a really good example. We have one more question this week. We did not get any from XMR chat this week. Feel free to leave questions anyways. We appreciate you guys. This last question came from Patreon from Frank S. Hi, SR crew. I've been staying away from using voice assistants. I did not trust them to keep my data private, and we have seen a few companies break their promises in this regard. Recently, I learned that smartphones can do many voice assistant tasks on device. So first question, how do you see the space currently? Which of the well-known services are private and which are not? And second question, are there ways to use Apple Siri in a private manner, and how do you set this up? Truthfully, I don't have answers to any of these questions. I don't use any voice assistants myself. I'll admit I kind of miss them. Voice to text on Siri was pretty awesome, and I do miss that sometimes. But I'm with you, like Apple specifically has been caught sharing Siri recordings with like third-party contractors to like train their voice recognition and stuff. So it does suck. The only one that I specifically knew of was Mycroft, which I think has ceased development because they ran out of money. And also that wasn't like a phone thing. That was more like a home assistant kind of thing. I'm certain there's probably something out there, but I'm not really familiar with what it is. So I'll turn it over to Henry and see if you have any input on these questions.
Yeah, I don't know of anything off the top of my head. It's a tough thing because one of the cool things with AI is we're starting to see more awareness and publicity over what's local versus what's not local. This is not something I've seen people really think about or discuss in the past. Normally, tech just kind of works and people don't think about, oh, how is this technology working behind the scenes? But for the first time with AI, people kind of have to understand, oh, is this AI model running online? Oh, that's why there's a 10-second delay, versus when it's on device, they have to be given disclaimers of, oh, this is on device. It's a much more limited model because it's running locally on your device and we don't have access to powerful servers to run this crazy stuff for you. So I actually really like that about AI. As for Siri, I do know disabling like Siri suggestions and just overall using Siri as little as possible is going to take you pretty far. But yeah, Siri's a tough one. I know you can opt out of things like manual review of your commands and stuff that you give to Siri. So there is a bit of granularity there. And then from there, it's kind of up to you if you want to trust Apple with the rest of it. But overall, I think of all the voice assistants, I would probably trust Siri the most of like the mainstream ones. But I still don't think that speaks too much to the protection you're actually getting. I think that it's still got a lot of room for improvement. And the answer is no, I don't know of like a good voice assistant that runs locally. The reality is, this might be a hot take, I don't know if it's possible to match the functionality because a lot of these voice assistants are like actively fetching information from the internet. So for example, I'll ask my voice assistant, what's the weather today? That can't be run locally. That needs to connect to the internet to be given that information. So I think we might be able to see a voice assistant run offline for things like, oh, turn on airplane mode or something like that. But I don't think we're ever going to see like an actual, it's just not possible to do everything a voice assistant does, if that makes sense. One thought, you could use voice control. I don't know if that still exists on iOS. Or yeah, I actually don't know what happened to that because that was kind of what I'm talking about. Voice control did like local control settings on your device without any internet connectivity. So I don't know if Siri, if it's been integrated into Siri, so when you're offline, Siri just kind of still has that functionality built in. I don't know. I haven't looked into it.
So I did a quick search just now on Brave. I did look at Siri specifically and what it does privacy-wise. According to Apple, they try to do as much on device as possible. And it's funny you mentioned the weather because they use that example. They're like, if you ask what's the weather in my area, obviously they have to connect to the internet, but they're going to try to use a coarse location. Basically, they're not going to Google what is my weather at 123 Main Street. They're going to say, what's the weather in Chicago? Or, I mean, Chicago's a big area. So like, you know, a smaller area. They're going to try to pick a general area instead of your exact location. But on the other hand, and again, this is the example they used, if you say like, what's the nearest Chinese restaurant to me? Well, now it needs to know your exact location to know where the nearest Chinese restaurant is. They say that anything they send to a server is only used to train the AI and not like ever sold for advertising, which is something. I mean, obviously it's still sending data back to them, but point being, it's not perfect. And I'm not saying that everybody should use it, but I'm saying like, I think from what I can tell, this is probably the best thing on the market. Then I did a search for private voice assistants. I don't know how old this is because Reddit hates everyone who's not logged in right now, but I do see a Reddit thread that somebody says DCO on F-Droid, DICIO.
Exactly what I was just about to bring up. Yeah, I'm on their GitHub right now.
I haven't heard of that before, so that's not an endorsement.
DICIO looks good, I gotta say. Like, it's on Android, it's open source, and it uses things like OpenStreetMaps. You can open apps, and it's more for like local things and then set a timer. it seems pretty solid.
So that could be worth checking out. Yeah, unfortunately, this is not a great space. And I kind of get why. Like, I feel like this would be a very difficult thing for somebody to just program in their free time. Maybe if Mozilla still exists in 10 years, when they're done spending money like a drug-addled rich kid, they might invest in something like this, or maybe Brave will, or I don't know. But yeah, it would be nice to see more investment in this area because it doesn't look like there's a lot of good options. And those were our questions this week. So our opinions on getting into privacy despite years of not being that private with your data, our suggestions for contact backups, voice assistants. Unfortunately, not a lot of great suggestions there, but we did our best. RSS, mass surveillance, and different security strategies. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for everyone who asked a question this week. We really appreciate your questions, and we appreciate your support for the podcast. If you're not already on Patreon, you can join the Q&A at patreon.com/surveillancepod. And as a bonus, you can also join our patron-only Signal chat, which is pretty lively lately, and we're enjoying everybody there. And if you just want to ask a one-off question, we still have xmrchat.com/surveillancepod. You can donate in Monero and just ask one question. And we didn't get any questions from there this week, but we have every week prior since we introduced it. So we appreciate all of you as well. And thank you guys for tuning in, and we will see you this coming weekend on the next episode of Surveillance Report.